So here's the scene. The Israelites, freed from slavery in Egypt, are crossing the desert on their way to the promised land, and they are hungry. And so they grumble. They grumble against Moses, their leader. In fact, they're so hungry they say, "Hey, Moses, you know what? We were better off when we were slaves back in Egypt because we had bread and meat to eat every day. Maybe we should have stayed there. Maybe we should go back. Maybe we should go back." Do we understand what's going on here? This isn't just about choices on a menu. This is not a matter of the local soup kitchen being closed. This is about a people on the verge of accommodating the terms and benefits of their freedom, their autonomy, and their faith for the sake of their comfort, their personal gain, and relief. The comfort of a full belly, the gain of self-preservation, and relief from the burdens of faith's rules and regulations. I think on first hearing, this ancient account might sound primitive to our ears, but I believe it tells a story that's still very much a part of our contemporary situation and experience, and it raises questions for how we live our lives too. What's at stake here? Nothing less than this: a willingness to negotiate my freedom, autonomy, and belief in the interest of my comfort, personal gain, and practicality. Is any other dynamic more powerfully tempting us and steering today's moral discourse in our own times? Is any complex of questions and concerns more entangled and manipulated than in this intersection of freedom, autonomy, and faith, and our own desires, and our pride, and our ego? Are any of today's hot-button issues not heavily influenced and often settled by the negotiation of our values and our beliefs to the point that you and I are left in the desert, like the Israelites, the desert of a dry, barren secularism that mocks beauty and laughs at virtue? In some ways, things may not have changed much at all since the chosen people were grumbling in the desert. What we have to ask is, who's grumbling now? Who's grumbling today? Who's grumbling about how things are? Who's grumbling about how good things used to be? Who's grumbling about not having enough? Who's grumbling for a bigger share for themselves and a lesser share for them, whoever them might be in the present day? Who's grumbling about God's way being too hard, too restrictive, demanding, old-fashioned, confining, difficult, intrusive, challenging, rigid, burdensome? And who's grumbling because it seems that God is always asking us to be unreasonably generous, ridiculously patient, absurdly idealistic, impossibly understanding, selflessly compassionate, foolishly hopeful? What's at work in all of this? What's at stake? A willingness to bargain with, to negotiate, to modify the terms and benefits of our freedom, autonomy, and beliefs in the interest of our comfort, personal gain, and a world shaped more and more in our image more than the Creator's image. Our relationship with God speaks directly to this dynamic in our culture. Our relationship with God gives us freedom, but God circumscribes our freedom in order to protect it for us. Our relationship with God gives us an individual identity, but it defines our autonomy at the same time, so that we might be as genuinely human as possible, as genuinely human as God created us to be. Our relationship with God helps us to live as God commands, so that order, beauty, and peace might be preserved, and chaos, discord, and anarchy be avoided. The Lord is not opposed to our freedom, but he calls us to take care lest our freedom become license. The Lord is not opposed to our comfort and pleasure, but calls us to find our greatest happiness in bringing joy to others. And the Lord is not opposed to human intelligence and ingenuity, but calls us to recognize the divine source of all our creativity, our gifts, and our talents, taking care never to seek our own fulfillment and satisfaction at the expense of another. The gospel mentioned, and you'll remember from last week, the throng of 5,000 people that Jesus fed with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Well, some of those folks are still following Jesus in today's gospel. And Jesus knows they're looking for more to eat. They're hungry again. They're grumbling. But he cautions them not to seek and to work for food that perishes, but to work for that food that lasts and which nourishes the soul. What kind of food do you and I work for? Well, the truth is we do work for food that perishes. We need to put perishable food on our tables so we can eat and survive. And Jesus doesn't object to that at all. But he's asking us, do we work as hard? Do we hunger and thirst as much for food that truly lasts? Another way to answer that question would be for us to look at this. In what freedom or freedoms do we most earnestly and persistently invest ourselves? And what limits on our personal freedom are we willing to accept to ensure the freedom of others? How jealously do we guard our individual personal autonomy, and at what expense is that to the community around us, at home, at work, in the world? How consciously do we plan how we surrender our self-interest for the benefit, for the good of others? And how honestly, faithfully, doggedly do we live what we profess to believe? In what practical ways do we defer to God's will, God's word, in the choices and the decisions we make every day? In the story from Exodus, God sent manna to feed the hungry Israelites. We'll read later on in the story of how the Israelites got tired of manna. They got tired of finding food at their doorsteps every morning. They began to grumble again, and they complained to Moses that this food is wretched. That provides us the perfect example of a people ready to override their relationship with God and to negotiate their freedom, autonomy, and faith for the sake of their own comfort and pleasure and satisfaction. In the gospel, Jesus offers us food which he says is greater than the manna in the deserts that the Israelites had. He offers us bread from heaven, which he promises will feed and nourish a life in us that will never perish. And that's the very bread that he'll give us today here at this table in Holy Communion. The bread Jesus speaks of in the gospel is the bread we will offer and receive here. We come here week after week to be refreshed, to remember, and to be reminded that there are in our lives gifts, blessings, realities, and values that are non-negotiable, precisely because they define and sustain us in our relationship with our God. Jesus, foregoing all comfort, pleasure, and satisfaction, generously and graciously allowed his freedom to be stripped from him, his personal autonomy to be nailed to the cross, all so that his fidelity to his Father might be the mercy that is our peace. What he offered for us on the cross, he offers us today in the sacrament of this altar. So, stop your grumbling. Come to the table. Eat the bread of life. Drink from the cup of salvation. For this indeed is the food God offers his people, the bread which comes down from heaven and gives life to all the world.